Catastrophic Plate Tectonics, and I have the word miracles with it because its mechanisms are based on miracles, as we'll see. We'll quote the lead author, who's a geophysicist from Los Alamos National Labs, and a man I've interacted with over the years, and I do love him dearly. Talked to him a few times, a number of times this year, met him in person this year. They based their model on miracles. This is the model promoted by all the big creation groups for the most part. So these are the groups that support catastrophic plate tectonics and its miracles. And these are the scientists who do, and many others, Baumgartner, Austin, Snelling, Humphreys. Let's go to catastrophic plate tectonics and the accelerated radioactive decay. They call that project the R.i.p project. The fact that they claim a lot of miracles, well, there are 343 miracles in the Bible. And I know because I counted them one time. There's a lot of miracles. This chart shows how they're distributed, and that comes from my life's work. It's called The Plot, an overview of the Bible. It's my labor of love, and it's on page 228. You know, there, God does a lot of miracles. We know that. But we can appeal to miracles implied in the Bible, but if we have physics problems in our flood models, we should not appeal to miracles that the Bible does not imply. Because if you do, then anybody's idea is equally valid. What's the difference, really? It's just, oh, well, this evidence doesn't support your model. Well, at that point, God did a miracle. Oh, but then this evidence doesn't support it. Well, that was another miracle. Well, how about this evidence? That was another miracle. Well, how do you refute that? So here's what John Baumgartner, he's the lead author of CPT. He wrote in CRSQ, which is the Creation Research Society Quarterly. Baumgartner wrote this: the physical laws were somehow altered by God to cause the flood catastrophe to unfold. So he's saying there must have been a miracle. Here's his miracle. Miracle number one: edges of the supercontinent get 700 degrees colder. Now, a lot of people have heard plate tectonics promoted for years, a lot of creationists. But they don't really know how it works because it's not bragged about very often. But here's the model. You had an original supercontinent, and plate tectonics say that these plates move the speed your fingernail grows, about an inch a year. But they need them to move fast. So to speed it up 1,000,000 times, they say that the edges of the supercontinent, the temperature plunged in a day to about near absolute zero. And that plunged, so it was a little warmer under the surface to start with, but it plunged 700 degrees. That made the rock more dense, and therefore it would sink into the mantle. Okay, more dense rock sink into the mantle. Well, there's a problem with that because when you run the physics and do the animation, the edges of the supercontinent get that cold and they're that dense and they're not going to sink into the mantle. They're just going to sit there, just very cold. So I wanted to establish each of these. So this is from 2002 in the Journal of Creation. Dr. Baumgartner wrote, an initial temperature perturbation is required. That means it got colder, right? We're not scientists, he is. An initial temperature perturbation is required to initiate motions within the spherical shell domain that represents the Earth's mantle. For this, a temperature perturbation of minus 400 degrees Kelvin to a depth of a few hundred kilometers is introduced around most of the perimeter of the supercontinent. So that is one of our leading creation scientists saying, here's how I believe the flood happened. The flood we read about in the Bible, the edges of the supercontinent got really cold. That's very ad hoc. That's just inventing ideas. Miracle number two, the Earth's mantle gets mushier. Because it gets real cold and nothing happens. So it's colder and denser, but if the mantle is mushier, the viscosity changes, the edges will start to sink. But maybe they were mushy to begin with, and after the flood they got firmer. Either way, it's a miracle. And that's from 1990, Proceedings of the Second International Creation Conference. The mantle's viscosity at the time of the flood was lower than at present to permit rapid sinking of the lithosphere into the mantle. Now we have miracle number 3. God removed the heat of accelerated radioactive decay. So they see all these radioactive elements in the crust. They know the Earth is young, so they say somehow the radioactivity sped up, but how? They admit they have no idea. If there were all these radioactive elements, they decayed rapidly, billions of years worth of decay rapidly, where atoms are shooting out particles, and those atoms become different elements then, and that they might shoot out more. Every time that happens, it produces heat. And all that heat, if it happened during the flood, it would melt the crust of the Earth, or nobody could survive. So they say they have a heat problem, and they very much openly say that God solved the heat problem. It's special pleading. So here is the RAPE project published by ICR, 2005, The Heat Problem. God was directly involved in all of these events, so it is possible that he employed some supernatural process which does not occur today or cannot be detected. That's a miracle to remove the heat. That is also said by Don DeYoung. He's the president of CRS, publishes that journal I just showed you. He wrote this in his book, Thousands Not Billions. Most biblical miracles require a temporary suspension of basic natural laws. Heat dissipation, that's the subtitle. Because the crust of the earth did not melt during the flood period, it is proposed that an enormous expansion of space, 20-fold times or greater, occurred during the flood event. Now, some of the RAPE team, scientists, have proposed this. Russell Humphreys has written this up as a serious proposal. Don DeYoung should say that was proposed, but it's not reasonable. It's not reasonable for us as creationists to say, well, our model has a heat problem, so the size of the universe expanded by 20 times in order to take the heat out of our floodwaters. That's not a reasonable, it's not a defensible, it's not justifiable. It's ad hoc, it's a rescue device. So, miracle number 4, extraterrestrial intervention to transport sediments. Now remember what we said earlier? However the flood actually happened, it has to erode enough rock that it could be deposited on the continents 1 mile deep. Imagine a mile deep of sand and rock and debris to cover just Indianapolis, 1 mile high. Then start going to Martinsville and just start spreading out. Get out to Warsaw. Think of how much rock that is. Go to Colorado. Cover the North American continent. Cover all the continents 1 mile high. That's a lot of rock. If you are eroding that rock because it's raining from the canopy theory, well, real quickly you're not going to be able to erode anymore because all that sediment is going to fall back down. And so you'll just be stirring up the bottom. Maybe at the bottom of, let's say, the floodwaters, there's a 1/4 mile thick of sediments. Let's say vapor canopy was right, and by some miraculous way, it eroded a 1/4 mile of sediments, which is inconceivable, but say it did. Well, how are you going to erode the next 3/4 miles of sediment? You can't do it. If you eroded a 1/2 mile deep of rock into grains of sand, enough to cover all the continents, then all that would have to be suspended in the floodwaters, circulating through the earth while you're eroding the next 1/2 mile. It's not possible. So they need miracles, the equivalent of miracles, to erode the sediments. Now, ask yourself, is that reasonable? For God to judge the earth, did he need to erode a certain amount of sediment, or did he need to drown mankind? The floodwaters killed everything that has breath in its nostrils on the face of the earth. So all mankind, except for Noah, his wife, and their 3 sons and daughter-in-laws, everyone was killed. Did it matter if we had a 1/4 mile of sediments, or 1 mile of sediments, or 5/8 of a mile. It didn't matter. So why would God need to do miracles just to erode sediments? Because your flood model can't explain where the erosion came from. So if CPT can't explain it, the vapor canopy theory has no way of explaining it. And once you erode it, you have to deposit it. And that takes tremendous turbulent flow, tremendous energy. So John Baumgartner proposed this. He did this summer in Pittsburgh at the 7th International Conference on Creationism, one of the greatest events I ever have gone to in my life. I was there at John's presentation. I read his paper. So he acknowledged using the software. Now, he is one of the world's better known geophysicists. He is a scientist who's worked at one of our national labs, Los Alamos, for many years. He created a software program called Terra for being able to study the interior of the earth, even though we can't get down there. And that's used by geologists around the world. He's brilliant, and he's a Christian who loves the Lord. So using his software, he said, catastrophic plate tectonics can't erode all that sediment, and it can't carry it and deposit it. So it has to be something else. So he checked to see, what if there were meteorite impacts? Could that do it? And he said, when you look at the earth, and it can't do it. We can't call on meteorite impacts. How about earthquakes creating tsunamis? He said, no, that doesn't do it. What if the poles flipped? What if that happened? Doesn't do it. We can't get that water turbulent enough to erode a mile deep of sediments and then transport them. We can't do it. So he wrote this paper, and he said, here's how we can do it. It is proposed that 6 near encounters with a moon-sized body, this moon-like body in outer space, the Earth's gravity caught it, it went around the Earth 6 times, and then it flew away. And that's where you can get the energy to erode all the rock and then transport it. And I think on its face, that is utterly unreasonable. With all the other miracles, now we have this moon thing. So he says the tide that would be caused would be 2,500 meters high. That's a 1.5 mile high tide. That's pretty serious. Presumably an interaction with some other body caused it subsequently to break free of the earth. Plate tectonics model is in meltdown. It is not a valid biblical model for how the global flood happened. It's not a valid scientific model. That's a commitment to a model. That's what that is, right? And we human beings, when you write a short story and you ask people to read it, and they say, well, did you ever think of changing this part here? And you're like, what are you talking about? That's my baby. You want to cut off his ears? You can't change my short story. So when you have scientists who've studied for years plate tectonics, and then they take it and they propose, this is how the global flood happened. It's plate tectonics sped up 1 million times. And then the more they study it, they see, well, it doesn't work here, so we need a miracle. And then it doesn't work here, we need a miracle. It doesn't work here, we need a miracle. Now, here, oh boy, it's weird to say God did a miracle and he eroded all the rock. So you have an extraterrestrial intervention rescue device. So we think that it's time to put to rest the catastrophic plate tectonics theory. Like YECist. They really did. Casket. Microsoft sent flowers. It was a tech firm in Denver. It's time for CPT to be put to rest.